This conference will now be recorded.
series. Welcome everybody to the second webinar for this climate resilient PPP series. Last week we looked at the case of Jamaica with the kind participation of the development of Jamaica. This week the focus is on the toolkit we have developed with EMG Rebel to implement, let's say, instruments and practical solutions in the PPP process for to create climate resilient PPPs. And today and next week, we're going to focus on two different phases of the process. Today is project origination and evaluation, and then next week is on financing and transition management. Just to remember that the work is available in two publications, one dedicated to Jamaica, and one is the toolkit we're going to focus today. They will be made available after the webinar by clicking these two links. And actually, today we launch as well the public consultation on the toolkit. The IDB and EMG Rebel, let's say, the best of our efforts to be comprehensive, but we reckon that given this is an emerging field, there might be other examples, project case, instruments that are being piloted and tested elsewhere. So we invite, let's say, the broad community of PPP experts and climate experts to provide comments in this public consultation form. The deadline is the end of July. Every comment we receive and we accept for inclusion will be duly reflected in the acknowledgement to the application. The consultation is online to this link, and we're gonna share it after the webinar and in social media as well. Finally, the agenda for today, we have the honor to have Gaston Astesiano, the head of the PPP training for us, especially giving an idea of what PPPs are and how the institutions is looking at this space. Then we have a focus on the toolkit with the technical team from EMG Rebel, Elisa and Marcel. And then we have two examples from the IDB of tools in practice. One with Mari Carmen and Daniela on climate risk screening and disaster risk screening in our projects, and the other from Anchor in how to include sustainable infrastructure in project preparation towards efficiency gains. Again, I'll be moderating the discussion, but feel free to propose questions in the chat. As you can see in the platform, we will take questions at the end of each intervention or and have then a final Q&A at the end of the session. Without further ado, Gaston, hopefully the technology is accompanying now, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gianleo. Team,
we can hear you perfectly.
Perfect, thanks. I think you can see me now. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate of this event. I think it's a very timely toolkit that we are presenting today, and as you mentioned, it's the product of a very good collaboration between you, Mariana, and Anchor that have been working together since last year with the government of Jamaica. And I think it's interesting to reflect on the new situation, the new scenario, which we didn't know we will have it when we started working on this. The COVID-19 pandemic had generated an impact unprecedented in the world and in our region. Some studies from our research department show that our region will have a decline of between 6.3% and 14.4% in the next 3 years under different scenarios. And in these times of crisis, Latin America have shown that a sharp reduction on capital expenditure. This is both in new investment and maintenance of infrastructure. We know now that this has a very severe impact, not only on growth. If we see that not maintaining the infrastructure, not investment in infrastructure could reduce GDP by 1%, but if we accumulate along the years, we can reach even 15% if that happens during a 10 years period. And this will have a very bad effect on the reaching of the Sustainable Development Goals for our region. And building resilient infrastructure and promoting inclusion and sustainable industrialization and fostering innovation. It's part of our agenda and our corporate priorities and at all levels in the SDGs. In addition to that, already the starting point of our region, unfortunately, is the one of an infrastructure gap. Our region needs a big expenditure in infrastructure. It's basically an agreement in the community of practice that the region invests less than it needs. Numbers vary, but more or less we need to either add another 2% or 3 or 4% of the GDP to reach between 4 and 5% of the GDP in total of investment in infrastructure. And it's in these times of fiscal restriction and competing priorities, because the new scenario generated by the pandemic not only has an impact on economic growth, but also on the new competing priorities due to the public health crisis. Makes new investment in infrastructure and maintenance in infrastructure less priority in the short run. So I think bringing in the private sector through public-private partnerships in sustainable infrastructures, it will be key for Latin American and the Caribbean countries to be able to at least maintain the stock of capital that they have in the infrastructure sector, and also to start to mobilize private capital in a sustainable fashion to resilient infrastructure projects. This will be key. We will, I think, there will be a double quality check in the new private investment in infrastructure. This will be of a requirement of flight to quality in terms of macroeconomic environment. Most private investors will start to look for sustainable macroeconomic environments, and within those sustainable macroeconomic environments, for very well structured projects that have a risk allocation and risk mitigation elements that allow them to feel comfortable to invest and develop their projects. So I think the project preparation phase, which is a critical role of the MDBs as catalysts of crowding in private capital by ensuring that the projects are prepared soundly with the right value for money, but also with a risk allocation that makes them not only beneficial for the society, but also sustainable in the long run, will be of the utmost importance in the new scenario post-COVID. I think today's session is very, very properly incorporated climate resilience in different stages of the PPP project, and not only from the identification phase, but from the business case, the transaction, and the contract management phase for the long life cycle of the projects will be more key than ever to reach efficient, sustainable infrastructure development for the region. Understanding the PPP procurement, the funding and financing, and the different aspects of the project contract structure will help to encourage more climate resilient projects. And I think the work you have been developing with the partnership with Rebel will be at least a very good guidance for governments interested in attracting sustainable investors to sustainable infrastructure projects. Thank you very much for let me open this webinar, Gianleo, and I pass it back to you.
Gaston, thank you for participating and for this kind words, but also to highlight in a very clear and no nonsense way the situation where we are with COVID, with this new framework, but the importance, I think, that we are seeing of a proper risk management in these long-term contracts that are PPPs. Elisa, up to you to start with presenting the toolkit and especially the project identification phase.
Establish compliance. There's history to this, and it's important to know this.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Elisa Donadi, and for the ones that are here for the first time, welcome. And then for the returning participants, it's a pleasure to have you back. So as Gaston was saying, we're going to talk a little bit today more on climate risk and how to incorporate it in practical tools into the PPP project cycle. Hold on. I cannot, just give me 1 second. I'm trying to, okay, there you go. So if we recap from last week's seminar, we identified 3 main policy recommendations to assess climate risk. First, by doing a high level as well as a detailed level analysis of such risk in a climate risk assessment, then to incorporate climate risk in the transaction phase by including requirements through the RFP and RFQ, output specifications for bidders, and then last, re-examine force majeure definition, excluding the regular climate events, as well as to include insurability clause in the PPP projects. These three main recommendations turned into, okay, sorry, I'm having like troubles clicking the presentation, but I think we're fine now. Let's see. Okay, so first, from those 3 main policy recommendations, then we have a very comprehensive, as you can see here, very comprehensive toolkit with, I don't know, more than 20 tools, I would say. We're not going to have enough time for this webinar series to go in detail in all of them, but we will definitely touch upon some of what we think are the more emblematic or interesting tools. Today, we're going to talk about project identification and business case. And as for climate risk assessment, we're going to do a very high-level review, as Mari Carmen will later explain the IDB methodology that offers a variety of options on how to do climate risk. We just took inspiration from that methodology into this specific case of Jamaica. But we're going to dive deep into how to incorporate those climate risk or the resiliency of, towards climate into the cost estimates, and as well as the value for money assessment that for me is one of the most interesting assessments in this project, in this process. Okay, so first at this stage, in the project identification, teams will do a high level assessment of the exposure to some of the climate hazards, as well as how vulnerable the project is to such hazards, to later develop a overall climate risk profile. I just want to reiterate that in this process, both identification and business case, these tools are applicable to both PPP projects as well as traditionally procured projects. Okay, so these tools in the first section in the project identifications, they build on one another. It looks very similar to what a risk assessment looks like. Basically, probability times the risk will give us a climate risk assessment or a risk profile. And as I said, we're going to try to identify those the exposure to those hazards, the vulnerability to the of the asset to those hazards to identify the climate risk. So first, the tool will give you a very long list of potential climate hazards. They could be landslide, hurricane winds, tsunamis, and so on. And basically what we want to do in this first stage is just to answer the question, what is the likelihood of occurrence of the various climate risk in my project area right now and in the future? And I think when we read these questions, you may think that this is very mathematical, but this is rather a conversation to have with several experts to understand if this is something that happens X numbers of times a year in a given year, or if climate experts think that this could increase in the future. So the toolkit will give you a very easy to follow guidance on how to do this. And one recommendation here is to try to build upon regional and in-country data and less on the global data, as meteorological data in-country may be more precise. So for the second tool that will be built on the first one, what we want to answer is how significant would the damage to my project be if any of these hazards may happen. So let's say if we're talking about an airport, we can think about how water shortages may affect the passenger services. So then there's the same logic by different hazards. We try to identify the potential vulnerability of the asset towards that hazard and try to identify a measure, whether it's like low, medium, or high, depending on how severe or how vulnerable the project would be. And then that combination will give us the high-level climate risk profile. Basically here we want to understand if we have medium to high risk of the hazard to happen, as well as medium to high risk of the project being vulnerable to that hazard. So that's for the first set of tools. Then for the second phase, the business case is a little bit more comprehensive. We also have a climate risk assessment in more detail. I'm not going to touch upon that right now. Then we have the risk valuation measures, which is embedding the resiliency and cost estimates. And then we have how to implement those climate risk in other studies, which it might be a little bit more interesting, as is it's included in the financial studies, value for money assessment, as I said before, and so on. So first, we try to develop these tools to help teams consider how the climate risk will impact the project cost. So we have different buckets when thinking about cost estimates. First, and of course, thinking about the preparation and transaction costs. How much does it cost to assess climate risk? Assessing the impact of climate risk on the project, any new design and specification on climate resilience standards. Then the idea here is just try to think what would be the variation of the cost based on these new standards. Then we have the cost estimates per se, which is the inclusion of this construction cost, capital cost, to follow some sort of the resilience standards that we assess in the previous studies in the climate risk assessment. Also to include mitigation measures as well that probably are going to be needed at some point in the project life cycle, and probably the higher insurance cost if that would occur. And then as well, we have to think of things like cost of construction delays due to extreme weather events. Then when we think about operational costs, it's the same. We need to think about if there are going to be, higher maintenance costs due to more repairs, higher or lower operational costs in general. Maybe there are some like energy efficiencies, but regardless of that, it's important to think about those variables. Disaster response cost, insurance, again, if we haven't counted it, and replacement of other parts of our assets due to more severe weather event. And then very important is just to think about the financing cost. Would the project have a higher interest rate due to higher risk markup, or would it change? Also making sure that we take into account financing costs due to change in repayment schedule due to extreme weather events if they occur. So this is basically what we see in the tool when we want to estimate the cost in part of the capital projects. We wanted to explain a little bit of, or maybe elaborate a little bit of the emerging practices that we found. As you know, there were not many examples globally, but we did find something very interesting. The Confederation Bridge in Canada was built about 20 years ago. So you would think that they were already very advanced in incorporating climate resiliency into this specific project. Basically, at the business case stage, the project teams started to think that maybe they wanted to do a run a climate scenario with the sea level rise higher than expected in their climate models, and they came into the conclusion that it was better to elevate the bridge 1 meter above the previous requirement, and this of course had an increase in the project capital cost by 10%. And interesting enough, when I was preparing this presentation, I saw that they're actually currently doing a climate risk assessment for this specific project. So this is a good example of best practice, definitely. And then here, turning into how to identify the proper evaluation techniques, we have are going to be important because at some point we need to monetize, if we want to call it that way, this risk that will help the other assessments. So we have options from sensitivity analysis, which are analysis that require less data and expertise, to probabilistic analysis. We're not going to go in detail on what is the purpose of each of these analyses, but basically the tool will provide users with this different choices, and as well we'll explain more in detail on how to, which is very important, step by step, how to do this valuation techniques. So similar to the evaluation, we also want to make sure that we consider climate risk in the cost benefit analysis. If it wasn't previously considered, there are a series of steps in this tool in particular that help users understand and really think through this climate risk and the cost benefit analysis. And as of the financial analysis, we also, very important, like the cost estimates, the tool 2.4 will give a lot of the inputs that are needed in order to do the financial feasibility, the cost estimates that need to be incorporated in the model. So let's say that if they weren't being considered before, then there are a series of steps that will guide through the incorporation of climate risk and resiliency towards the financial feasibility. Basically, first by determining a business case on regular commercial assumptions, then review each of the cost and revenue items and determine whether this climate influences any of the assumptions. And as you can see, more of this activities require workshops with experts. They're not any mathematical exercises, but it's more like discussion with experts and then incorporating this in the financial model. So for the assumptions based on workshops, then we want to define alternative assumption per climate scenario. If those are not available, then determine some sort of like markup or deductions for overreaching costs and revenue by subcategories. Then make sure that we're not double counting the risk, and then draw the conclusions based on the financial feasibility. So this is a very quick review on how these tools help incorporate climate risk into the project business case. And I think with that being said, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Marcel so he can continue and explain a little bit of value for money.
Thank you. So Elisa just discussed at a high level how to do a climate risk assessment and how to the various tools that help incorporate the results of a climate risk assessment into financial and economic feasibility studies. I'm going to focus more on the value for money assessment, which is a particular assessment that is important in a PPP process. For most of you are probably aware that a value for money assessment is a structured comparison of delivery models. It compares a PPP approach to other approaches and helps answer the question, which approach is the best for my project. And it's the attempt is to do as much as possible an apples to apples comparison between various delivery models for the same project. And it considers all the risk adjusted costs and revenues in a project. Most value for money assessments have a qualitative and a quantitative piece, and they're both important. Sometimes people focus a bit too much on the quantification in a value for money assessment, but we should be aware that that value for money assessment cannot be very, very precise, and we should be careful not to create false precision. So that's why we feel that the qualitative analysis is at least as important as the quantitative analysis in a value for money assessment. Now, in that qualitative analysis, value drivers are the key components. So what the value for money assessment centers around is the potential drivers of differences between a PPP delivery and a more traditional delivery of a project. And actually that is true for both the qualitative and the quantitative analysis, and that's why we are focusing on that in our tools as well. There are not too many examples of inclusion of climate risk in a value for money assessment, and on the previous slide we're showing one example of where we found an agency incorporated climate risk explicitly in a value for money assessment, and that is Sendai City. They prepared a value for money assessment for like a school meal supply project, and compared a public delivery to a BOT delivery, and then asked themselves the question, okay, how are those approaches different in terms of resiliency and business continuity in extreme weather events and disasters? And they concluded, okay, because there's likely to be human resource constraints and organizational slack under the public delivery, we are expecting that under private delivery, the BOT approach, there will probably be a faster response to disaster and also recovery. This approach focuses very much on disaster response, and what we are trying to do in our toolkit is to actually make it broader and ask ourselves the question how we can incorporate climate risk and climate resilience throughout the entire value for money assessment. Moving on to the next slide. So here's the various value drivers that we are trying to consider that we just discussed. And if we dive a little deeper, then we are not just looking at for example, when we think about output-based contracting as one of the main drivers of a PPP, right? Because the idea is if we allow for more creativity from a private developer, then that may lead to better solutions. Now, better solutions can focus on disaster response on the right side of the screen, but it could actually already start at the design of a process, of a project. So if output-based output specifications actually allow for more creativity, more room for optimizing design solutions and also maintenance solutions, then it's more likely that we will get more climate resilient solutions, especially if we combine it with a transfer of climate risk, or at least a partial transfer of climate risk to a private developer. So the idea here is that output-based contracting can lead to more resilient solutions if we do allow the private developer to come up with its own solution, if we do transfer part of the risk. And those kinds of questions we're asking the user of the toolkit to consider when doing a value for money assessment. On the next slide, there's a few more value drivers that we would typically focus on in a value for money assessment. The first one on this slide is the performance-based payment mechanism that can more explicitly incentivize developers to mitigate climate risks. And those incentives can be both negative and positive. So think about incorporating performance indicators that would be tied to bonuses or penalties if those performance indicators are being met. So if the developer comes up with a specific climate risk mitigation approach, then enforcing the payment mechanism will help enforce that the private developer is actually gonna deliver on that climate risk mitigation approach. Private financing is another consideration. In general, we expect from private financing that it brings additional oversight and additional due diligence to a process. And the same would actually be true for climate risk. One of the if a financier is actually dependent on climate risk and climate resilience for the repayment of the loans it provided, it will probably make sure that the developer will have done everything it can to mitigate climate risk. So there too, we can see how the value driver of bringing in private financing may lead to increased oversight and better climate resilience measures. This is not the case for publicly financed projects, because when the government backs the financing, regardless of the performance of the project, it is and regardless of climate risk and other risks associated with the project, it is less likely to lead to that additional oversight. On the next slide, we have included a few more value drivers. Let me also focus on some of the more, let's say, downsides of a PPP approach, because we should consider both the pros and the cons of a PPP approach for a project. Two common negative value drivers for PPPs are considered to be transaction costs and inflexibility of a project. So what we're asking ourselves here is to what extent does climate risk impact transaction costs? So do additional requirements, does the requirement for bidders to develop climate risk mitigation plans, then also the obligation for the agency to evaluate those plans, will those increase transaction costs? So that those kinds of considerations we need to take into account when we do a value for money assessment. Inflexibility, like the typical consideration for a PPP contract is, okay, we're entering into a 20, 30, 40-year contract. That makes it that limits the flexibility of the public agency. And if you add climate risk to that, that could actually make the situation less attractive for an agency. So those are things we need to also consider. So these are some of the considerations on how to incorporate climate risk and climate resilience into the value for money assessment. The final tool in the business case is a tool that also helps incorporate climate risk in the environmental impact assessment. I want to make one interesting observation here. When we were doing our work with the government of Jamaica, several stakeholders immediately thought about environmental impact assessments when we started talking about climate risk. And it seems to be the logical place to incorporate climate risk and climate resilience. However, environmental impact assessments focus on the impacts, typically focus on the impacts that a project has on its surroundings. And of course, that is relevant to consider, but it's equally relevant to consider how climate risks impact the project itself and not just the project surroundings. So that's why we have made an attempt to not only incorporate climate risk in an environmental impact assessment, as we're doing in this tool, but more in general, think about all the various ways of incorporating climate risk in the various feasibility studies, economic, financial feasibility, and value for money assessment for a project. And that's basically the overview of the toolkit on the next slide that we have been discussing with you. As was mentioned before, we are this week, we wanted to cover some of the tools in phases 1 and 2, project identification and business case. Next week, we'll dive into the transaction and contract management phase. And with that, I want to turn it over to John Leo.
Thank you, Marcel. Thank you, Elisa. Before posing you a question, there is one point I think I wanted to highlight from this and to give context most to the audience. Most oftentimes, let's say, when we start including this, other dimensions to the PPP process, the most natural reaction from the professional, from the agency, is to call a consultant, commission a study, and assess. With this toolkit, I think one of the main objectives we had was to try to give something to PPP professional and PPP agencies that could be used in-house. Often, and with the greatest value, I think, understanding when you don't need actually to do much because it's been already done. A lot of times when you just need a qualitative assessment, I think here the word qualitative is very important because it's not always the solution to spend $1 million in a quantitative assessment. And we'll see it in with Mari-Carmen and Daniela. And only trigger, let's say, professional studies, external evaluations, engineering work, really when it's needed, material, and highly relevant for the process, and when it adds value. I think what Marcel mentioned, transaction cost, is a key relevant metric here, because we don't want to add to the process that is already quite detailed and long, another dimension when it's not relevant or when it doesn't really add value. Before moving to Mari-Carmen, Marcel, and Elisa, one clarification question from the audience. You mentioned CBAs, and Guillermo mentioned that typically CBAs are biased towards the least robust solutions. I think is in the nature of the discounted cash flow analysis. Have you seen something similar? Do you have any reflection on this? Especially consider many times climate scenarios can be treated implicitly equal in probability of realization. And how do you manage the deep uncertainty in CBA? I don't know if in your revision of tools you've seen CBA's analysis managing uncertainty.
Yeah, so I can briefly respond to this. I think I do recognize the point, because I think the point is in a CBA, where especially if you focusing especially on the quantitative assessment, right? We're doing a net present value calculation, meaning that everything you spend upfront is going to need a whole lot of benefits later to basically offset those additional investments. And if we struggle to monetize those future benefits or reduce costs, then it's going to be difficult to make it work. I think that's the general point. I do agree, but actually this is related to the point you were just making, John Leo. Is I also feel that sometimes we're trying to go too far in a quantification. Some benefits or some reduced costs cannot be monetized, and therefore maybe we shouldn't try, right? And maybe it should be more of a balancing of qualitative consideration of a more robust approach and additional costs. But so back to the point. The nature of an NPV calculation is that upfront costs weigh very heavily, and therefore it's going to be more complicated to make it work with very uncertain and benefits in the very far future.
Thank you, Marcel. I'll invite people to put questions in the chat. We'll do another session of Q&A after the presentation from Mari-Carmen and Daniela. Mari-Carmen, we have already one question for you and Daniela, if you can include it in your presentation. If you can suggest if there are good sources of data where countries or experts can find information about the hazards that affect specific regions, thinking about the location of a project. And I would actually ask you to highlight this balance between quantitative and qualitative, as I remember as being your colleague for some time, has been a struggle as well in the IDB, considering the transaction cost in developing projects from our side too. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Gianleo. Just a sound check. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you and see you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. My name is Mari Carmen Escribiel from the Climate Change Division, and together with my colleague Daniela Zuluaga, we will present you the disaster and climate change risk assessment methodology for IDB projects. Let me first start with an outline. Is this going? Okay, there it is. So an outline of the presentation. I'll first go through an institutional background of how this work is framed at the IDB, then give you an overview of the methodology, which has 3 phases and 5 steps. And then I'll pass it on to Daniela, who will go in more depth into these 3 steps and phases. And then she'll give some lessons learned. First, let's look at the institutional background. For now, the IDB has a disaster risk management policy, OP 704, with an approach very focused on prevention, right? So it has a directive that's focused on programming. And then Directive 82, which is the one we will focus on today, is based on the screening and the risk assessment. So basically, it tells the IDB to look at all the profile, the project pipeline, and categorize the pipeline into high, moderate, or low risk, disaster risk, and then deal with the projects that are deemed important, high risk. Also, to add that the Sustainable Infrastructure Framework has this topic in one of its 4 pillars. The environmental sustainability pillar includes climate resilience, and it includes this integrated approach that we're talking about of disaster and climate change risk. And before going on, I also like very much to open these presentations with an index, the Index of Governance and Public Policy in Disaster Risk Management, led by Sergio and team in the disaster risk management team of the IDB. And Sergio can correct me if not later, but it's close to 60% of the countries in Latin America that already ask in the public investment system, they ask a question on risk. They ask for the pipeline to be categorized. So there's appetite for this in our clients, in the countries. What we need all of us to learn more together is, how do we do this? What is a practical way of doing this? And what do we do in projects that are deemed a high risk? As part of this institutional background, also to let you know that at the IDB, for us, it's been very important to have a group, an interdisciplinary, intersectorial group between the Climate Change Division, the Environmental, Rural Development and Disaster Risk Management Division, and the Environmental and Social Safeguards Unit. So this helped us a lot to come to a unified methodology. And of course, we have worked very close together with all our colleagues in these divisions and with other units of the bank, right, other divisions. We started with the infrastructure divisions, right, energy, transport, water, and sanitation, and we've been moving more and more also to rural and urban development, and then to education and hospital, because they also build infrastructure. So to let you know that for us, this has been a key part, and will continue, because we need to keep learning also from the risk assessments we do, and we keep enriching the methodology. Here I leave you 2 links. One is a shorter executive summary that basically says what Daniela and I will mention in the presentation. And the second link is a very detailed kind of manual that you can consult, or your counterparts or the companies that are doing this work can consult in more depth of suggestions we have on how to do these studies. So let's jump in. Basically, the methodology has 3 phases. First, there's a fast screening and classification phase. Then there's a qualitative phase and a quantitative phase. This, as you see in the line below, this goes with the project cycle, right? And we will tell you which phases need to be done by board time of the project cycle. But one important message here is that we have learned a lot in time flexibility in the project cycle is very important, because we want the assessments to be done when it's more useful for the project, when there's the information already to be able to have some important conclusions. We also want it to be done early enough so we can address the challenges. So there's a sweet spot there in timing. These 3 phases are then divided into 5 steps. And here, before going in depth into all the steps, just to mention that we have learned a lot in this process, right? We did some risk assessment probably more than 4 years ago. We learned from them and we enriched the methodology. Because before at the IDB, we would jump a lot from the hazard and exposure phase, the first step, to a quantitative phase. So all the steps in the middle are a lot of what we have learned in this process. So now our proposal for this methodology is a first step where there's a preliminary classification based on location and hazards. We learned that you need to combine that with a step 2 on criticality and vulnerability. So we have to revise that first classification on hazard and exposure based on the criticality and vulnerability of projects, because we were learning there's a lot of places that can have a lot of hazards, so you can get a lot of red maps. But it depends also what is the project financing. It's very important to have that in the category. Then after that, you can have low risk projects exit the process. For moderate and high risks, you need a disaster risk narrative, which basically is a simplified qualitative risk assessment. And we want to do this basically for 2 reasons. First, because it's important that in our records, there is a small summary of what we are thinking of risk in this project, because we found projects where there was a lot of information of risk, but it was probably in the design studies, and it was, there's some design studies that are very long, and it was probably in page 1,000, right? So we need to have a small, short summary that says what's needed and what we are finding. But we also want to take advantage of other studies that the projects are already doing. If they're already doing hydrological studies or other studies, and we grab the project early enough, let's put the disaster and climate change risk things already there, so we don't have to do another study. So some projects will exit in this phase. For projects where more information is needed, we need another step. And basically here, the lessons learned to always start with a qualitative step before jumping into quantitative. And it's also for 2 reasons here, because a qualitative analysis, as has been said before by colleagues, might be enough. So for some projects, they might be able to come up with very good adaptation and disaster mitigation measures here. It might be enough. And then in the projects where there's a quantitative analysis that's needed, then that quantitative analysis can be more specific, right? The qualitative analysis can say, I need a quantitative analysis on A, B, and C. So that helps a lot, so we don't have 2 disaster risk assessments that are too general. Sometimes we had found that before. They were good risk analysis, but they weren't telling us that much. We need at the project level to have this specificity. And with that, just again, before passing it to Daniela, said that this sequential and gradual approach is very important, and that we will share with other institutions common principles. But in the end, any tool should be tailored to the needs of that institution, right? So I think that's a message we want to carry across. This was very useful for us, and I think there's common principles that can be gathered, but in the end, it's very important that each institution sees what it needs to answer. So with that, I pass to Daniela. Thank you.
Thanks. So now I wanted to reflect a little on the methodology, that the way we have seen how it works or how it can be applied is that it can be applied 2 ways. first on a project specific level, which is the way we as the IDB have been applying it to our own projects. And then, but also as a system or as a process, we also found that we can replicate this logic to other systems. Of course, with what Marika was mentioning, adapting it to their own conditions. And this is what basically we did with the case of Jamaica and the PPP framework. So the idea was, as Marika was saying, we follow these principles or this logic, but then we really start analyzing their own conditions. On the next slide, we can see how the idea is, the methodology that we're going to present today is reflects the IDB's own process, the IDB's own project cycle. But then what we really need to find out or ask the question is, how do other systems look like? And then in the next slide, we can see then how we can start populating how the methodology would look like for these other systems. So how would the steps look like for them, not for us?
Danny,
so that's
quick question. Is it moving the PowerPoint? It's not moving for me. I don't know if it lets you.
No, it's not moving.
Mari Carmen, I will send you the request again.
You're on mute.
Okay, let's see. I see. Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Okay. Can you move to the next slide, please? So this is what I was saying. The idea is really to, when we want to replicate this in another country, in another system, in another institution, we just need to ask ourselves, how does their own project cycle look like? And then we can start saying, okay, then what are the tools that make sense for this step? Maybe we can have more steps, less steps. We just tailor it to the needs. But with that, I'm gonna go deeper into explaining what our methodology looked at for the IDB. So I'm gonna start focusing on the first phase. You can see there in sort of green. That's the screening and classification phase. Next slide. So the first phase has two steps, where the first step, as Mari Carmen mentioned, focuses on doing an assessment of the project's exposure to hazards. And for that, at the IDB, we have an internal bank central system to manage projects. So what we did is we created a questionnaire that's embedded in the bank system. So it's a questionnaire that the project specialists need to answer. And then we have provided some tools to just help the specialist in how to answer those questions. So this is how the questionnaire looks like. It really asks first if the project is exposed to hazards, and then if maybe climate change is an aspect of the project that is central to the project or not. That also gives us a first alert if we need to contact the climate change division and add someone to the team. But then here, as you can see, there are specific questions on the exposure of the project to different hazards. So we have all kinds of hazards, and then you answer yes or no, and what's the extent of the impact expected. So for the specialist to be able to answer these questions, that we have provided a support tool. So the support tool is basically a map platform. Next slide. So this is what we have at the IDB, more specifically at the safeguards unit. We have created this ArcGIS platform where we have really gathered a lot of hazard maps for all the hazards that you can see listed there. We have both geophysical and climate related hazards. And so the idea is that the specialists can not only see, in the map, the hazards, they can turn on and off layers, but the idea is that they can also run a quick analysis, a screening analysis, where they can draw their own project location, or they can upload a shapefile with the project location or input coordinates. And then when they run this analysis in this tool that's in the platform, it will automatically cross-reference the project location with the hazard maps. And it will tell you, for your location, we found that you have intersection with all of these hazards. As you can see, for the climate-related hazards, we also have included, let's say, double maps. The first one are maps with the hazard without the effects of climate change, and then the same hazard, let's say flooding, with climate change, so that when you see both layers, you're going to see the effect of climate change on that hazard. So that also helps specialists see, climate change will really impact my hazard. It will make it worse, or it will even sometimes decrease the hazard. So this tool allows us to see the hazard side of the risk equation. But then, as Maria said, we also need to look at the vulnerability component of the project. Next slide. And for that, we have the second step, which is focus on criticality and vulnerability of the project. For that, the objective really is to ask ourselves, okay, now that I know what the hazard sites are in my project area, now what is my project? Am I going to have infrastructure, yes or no? And if I'm going to have infrastructure, then am I going to build something small, something huge? Is it going to be complex? Is it going to be simple? And those things are going to help us really, let's say, balance the elements of hazard. Can you go to the next slide, please? So for that, we have been working internally at the IDB with other sectors, the infrastructure sectors, and we have been trying to develop more sector-specific guidance into how you can start thinking if your project is more or less vulnerable to these hazards. And for that, we have developed what we call criticality charts, which are basically just a visual way of understanding for a certain project type what are its main characteristics, less or more vulnerable. And this is just the example that we have created for the sector of water, sanitation, and drainage. But we have similar charts for transport, for roads, and for hydropower infrastructure. And now, more recently, we have for education, for health, for urban development, and for irrigation projects. So here, you can start thinking about what are your physical characteristics. In this case of water, do you have any water retraining structures that if they fail, they could impact people? If you're providing water service, that's an essential service. What would happen if you have loss of that essential service? And then what's the impact to the population? So this is the idea of we really want to go, sector specific into complementing that hazard view. So now with this, with both aspects, the hazard and the vulnerability, we can now assign a classification for the project, and that's going to be the guide for the rest of the methodology. Well, at this point, the projects that are classified as low risk, they exit the process and there's nothing required to do. But for projects that are moderate or high, they need to continue on. So for those projects, we entered now the phase 2. Next slide. Now, if you remember from our methodology, phase 2 is really important. It's really the qualitative assessment. And this is sort of our filter where we start, because the idea, our objective is to really go in and zone in into the specific aspects of a project that need more to go deeper into. So next slide. So in this phase, we have also 2 steps. The first step is the narrative. And as Maria Carmen said, we want to start doing sort of an investigation work into gathering what are all the documentation of the projects, asking questions, what has been done before, are there existing studies, maybe someone already has analyzed the flooding in the area, maybe the design considerations already account for some of the risks. So why is this important? Because we have seen that a lot of things are already being done, but we just need to gather everything and then really pinpoint what's really missing, because we don't want to ask studies and studies and studies just because, and then find out, oh yes, this was already considered from the beginning in the design. So this is to say, okay, this is what we found, this is what the project has, and then this is what it's missing, and this is what I'm going to focus on if I need something else. So this is the part of the qualitative aspect that Jean-Leo was mentioning that's really important for us. And this is our filter to start, because we don't want to ask every single project to do, you know, standalone, expensive, complex studies just because. We really, in this stage, we can find those projects that are really have already incorporated these things into its own design and preparation process, and it can even exit at this point if at this point we find that they have, you know, covered the topic of risk really well, they have identified all things, they have proposed measures, that we can just summarize it into this narrative, document it, and then it exits the process and we don't ask anything else of them. But then some projects we will find some gaps, and that's when we move to a second qualitative assessment, which is more complete. So for this assessment, we also offer, you know, a variety of options, but basically this would entail doing something more analytical in the way of, for example, doing risk matrices to examine now with the project what are the, you know, qualitatively what's the severity, the expected severity, and the expected probability of occurrence. We can also do some workshops, failure mode workshops, to determine how the infrastructure could fail. And then we can also use, you know, qualitative approaches with indicators. So this would really help us dive a little bit more into depth into the risk of the projects. And again, here it could be enough for many projects with many, you know, smaller, simpler, not so complex projects. This could be enough, because this could give us already some really specific measures that we can propose to the project, and then they can exit at this stage as well. But then if at this stage we find that the project is, you know, it's really complex, we really have some uncertainties that we really want to, you know, try to understand better, then we move to the last phase, which is the quantitative assessment phase, which has only one step. So in this step, again, what we want to do is quantify. So here we offer, again, also a range of options of methods to do this. But basically, we want to, you know, more scientifically and technically model risk. And for that, we need to model first the hazard, whatever it is that we're studying. It can be flooding, it can be drought, it can be hurricanes. We also model, you know, what are the characteristics of the exposure, what are the physical characteristics if I'm assessing buildings, if I'm assessing bridges, if I'm assessing dams, and what's its structural vulnerability. So how would those houses respond to an earthquake or a flood? And then we just apply, you know, a specific mathematical model to quantify, to unite those three aspects, and then quantify on one side economic losses, so damages and losses, and then on the other hand, you know, impacts to population, so it could be injured or even death of human lives. Next slide. So we, you know, I know that Elisa and Marcel also talked about the quantification, and it really is important to know when this is useful, when it is not, or it's not necessary. But we have found that when it is useful because you can, for example, compare alternatives of project design or risk mitigation measures. So this is just a hypothetical example of how we can use it. So this is, you know, an example of flooding. That's the hazard modeling of a flood. And then hypothetically, I'm going to study the effects on housing. So I build my risk model, and then I run it for a first time in its original situation. And my model is going to tell me that the expected economic loss is around 10%. But then I propose one alternative, which is I'm going to just, you know, move back the whole village a couple of, I don't know, 100 meters away from the edge of the river. and I'm going to run my model again, and it's going to tell me, okay, with this setup, your risk is now, your loss is now 6%. So I know I decreased from 10 to 6. But then I say, what if I do another option? What if I, instead of moving the houses, I'm just going to leave them there, but I'm going to elevate them in stilts. And I run it again, it's going to say the loss now it's 5%. So having these numbers is really useful to compare and see which one is better. And again, this is what will allow me, if I want to do analysis such as cost benefit analysis. But then here again, we offer a variety of tools. So not only can you do cost benefit, you can do cost efficiency, multi-criteria, and even here then you can apply a robust decision-making framework to find precisely those robust measures that really behave well under a wide range of uncertainty. So with that, I wanted to show you quickly an example of how we did in a project in the IDB. This was a project in F4 Road.
1 minute.
Yeah, perfect. This is, I'm just finishing. This is how we did it in Haiti for a road project, where we did the whole thing. We did the qualitative analysis. We identified that there were some things for the specific bridges that we needed to quantify. So we did a quantitative model. We incorporated climate change into the hazard modeling. We did the vulnerability, and then we quantified risk. And then if you see from the graphs, those are the risk with and without measures. So that's how we can show that the measures that we were proposing would really reduce the risk. And then finally, we also really strive to incorporate the climate change really embedded into a standard analysis that already exists and that engineers do anyway. So this is an example of a hydrological and hydraulic analysis that any engineer would do to design a road, a bridge. And really what we're saying is you do what you always do, but just, plug in this extra 3 steps and you're good. So that's also the idea for methodology. And with that, I'm going to finish just a couple of lessons learned. The methodology really is an integrated approach between climate change and disaster risk. It's a sequential and gradual process, as Maricarmen was saying. We really want to filter out and not just do everything for every project. It allows also for time flexibility in the project cycle, and this is tailored to our project cycle. But as we were saying, the common principles of how the process of assessing should work can be applied to others. It just needs to be tailored to the conditions. And also something that Jean-Léo also mentioned and Rebel mentioned is that it's important to have these tools also in-house capacity and not just do everything, higher studies and higher studies and higher studies. And with that, I finished. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniela. While we switch the presenting to Anchor, I have one question very quick for you. How much of this is open source? Let's say, are the hazard maps that you presented before something internal to IDB only, or they can be accessed by, let's say, expert or counterparties in the region?
So the hazard maps we use for screening are currently just in-house for the IDB, just because it's a question of licensing of the platform. But the maps that the data we use to create those maps, that is open. And one of the main sources we used is the maps, hazard maps from the Global Risk Assessment, or GAR, from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. So you can go into the Global Assessment Report website, and they have an online also map viewer where you can see the maps for many hazards, and you can download the data, which is what we did. So that's for most of the hazards. It has global coverage, so it's really useful for anyone to in any country to check out what are the hazards. These maps behind them have a really robust modeling method using probabilistic analysis. The only caveat for those maps is that they do not include climate change effects in the way of including climate change projections. So for that, I would recommend people to use one of the really good sources is the World Bank's climate change knowledge portal. And there they have, sort of summarized projections of climate change. The caveat with those is that they only give, the climate variables, so temperature, precipitation, not in terms of hazard. So what we had to do was combine the 2 sources to create our own maps. But those are 2 sources that you can always consult, and they're open.
Thank you, Dani. Ankur, over to you with efficiency gains from incorporating sustainable infrastructure in the PPP process. Ankur?
Hi, Jan Leo. I'm trying to get to the presentation. I wasn't expecting to receive the request to share screen. Are you listening to me?
Yes, we can see the presentation and we can hear you. So
okay, perfect. So I don't need to use the. Okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. In this session, I would like to highlight the importance of considering tools that improve project preparation and delivery, and the one previously presented by my colleagues and Mari Carmen and Daniela, and to understand the benefits of them. We, the IDB, acknowledge how important it is to invest in these pre-investment phases, and how important it is to have properly prepared projects and to develop a pipeline of well-prepared sustainable infrastructure projects, not only to meet the user's needs, but also to better inform investors, and what it's even more important, to make an efficient use of public resources. So something that we see in the region, and we think that it's a key topic in the region, is that there's a lack of capacity overall and experience, and sometimes in the public sector, in order to better prepare projects. And if we do a comparison, and this is something that we did together with the Economist Intelligence Unit, we can identify how proper project preparation is one of the main bottlenecks of sustainable and efficient infrastructure development in the region. In the most recent exercises that you're able to see right now, you can see how Latin American and the Caribbean only surpasses the ability of sub-Saharan African countries in order to prepare projects. And as an economist, I always tend to think in terms of costs and benefits. And I think that for most of you as public servants, this is a huge priority. For each implementation, for each policy, for each instrument or action that you need to implement, you need to weigh the cost of benefits of them. And this is something that we think that it's quite important to say, that sustainable project preparation is a complex, critical activity, as you're listening today, and entails some cost. So, in other words, we need to think this as an investment, as the investment of the pre-investment phase. And what do we know about the cost of it? Well, we know that the cost of preparing infrastructure projects I'm just talking about the numbers for developing economies. You can see that it ranges about 5 to 10% of the total project investment. This means like properly prepared projects to be sustainable and efficient. And as I was saying before, do not forget this. This is an investment, and where you invest in something, you expect to have a return. So what is the return of properly investing in the sustainable infrastructure project preparation? Basically, avoiding inefficiency through the different project development phases. And what happens when we do not invest the required time and money to properly prepare projects is something that I would like to show you over this presentation. And basically what we have is that we find inadequate project selection by not doing proper exercises as the cost benefits analysis, as our colleagues from IMG REL were discussing about. We also find excessive cost of the projects that are being executed. And a third cause of it is that the project development does not end when the asset is built, and there's a strong need of contract supervision and taking the most of the existing assets that we have in order to provide high quality services to users' need. And basically, by investing in proper project preparation, we want to avoid the so-called white elephants, right? Those useless infrastructures, over dimensions, and with zero or very low demand. And this is something that we see in the region. From some of the analysis that we have performed at the IDB, we see how countries face an efficient expenditure. And on average, this means that $1 out of $2 designated to the development of infrastructure is wasted. And this is an average figures of numbers in the region. So how can we improve this? Well, there are some useful tips that we know, and most of it, the ability to develop a proper regulatory framework, the government, the level of the government's effectiveness, the rule of law, and then transparency are highly related, according to what we see, to the levels of efficiency of the infrastructure development. So to the level of efficiency of the public resources that we destinated to the development of the infrastructure. And it's not only about the expenditure, what we see, where we see some inefficiencies. It's also that in some cases we can even see, and for some countries where we expect to have a high performance of the delivery of the infrastructure, is that we can even see how that budget is not even executed at 100%. So better planning also means more efficient investment in the way that investment is sound, and solid pre-investment exercises pays off, right? So I'm gonna try to move quick over this part of the presentation, but a way to see this is the excessive cost of the project that are being executed. And a way to size this is to see the levels of cost overruns and delays in the region. And what we see in Latin American and Caribbean countries, as you can see in the graph, is that cost overrun in the region almost double the world average, which is 28%, and in LAC is 48%. So while we may assume that some of these cost overruns are inevitable in a way, or we could call them as a technical cost overrun that you cannot avoid even doing all the exercises, because there's a lot of uncertainty sometimes in the development of infrastructure, we can even see the huge disparity between the world average, the best practices that you can see, and the numbers for LAC. And an exercise that we did at the IDB shows that those projects that receive sometimes the support of the MDBs, such as the IDB, the World Bank, etc., can reduce in a way cost overrun to 22%. So as I was saying, if you think that this can be conceived, this 22%, as a technical minimum cost overrun, the difference from the regional average from 48% to this technical minimum of 22%, or even to the world average of 28%, would mean savings around 1% of regional GDP. And that's a lot of money that reinforces the idea that proper planning and evaluation means more efficient use of resources, and consequently the possibility to implement more and better projects. And as you were seeing in the previous slide, in terms of money, you can also see that in terms of time. This is a very easy graph that contains some data related to the days that are required to complete the authorization and approval procedures by countries in the world. As you can see, LAC is in the red area, you would say, closer to those times of Cambodia, where you can reach like almost 2 years to get all the procedures, than to the top performer in the world, which is Singapore, where it takes 26 days. But the most important thing of the time delays is that it can produce some certain inefficiencies that at the end of the day means money. And some exercises that we have performed at the IDB you can see how these time delays can account up to 10% of project cost. Of course, all these studies that I'm mentioning right now are published, and we are happy to share with you in case that you are interested in knowing much more details. And third, because we can see how project development, as I was saying before, does not end with once the infrastructure is developed. There's a strong need not only of the contract supervision, but also to be able, from every single part of the public sector, to get the ability to make those in charge of contracts to make an efficient use of an efficient performance of the infrastructure in terms of proper maintenance, right? This is the way to produce high quality services over the whole life the asset. And this is something that we feel as an issue in the region. Just to show, for example, an example that it's not on the graph, but I think it's relevant to mention, regarding Peruvian roads from 1992 to 2005, you see how they spend 7 times more by rehabilitating roads than the cost that would have been required to do a preventive maintenance over that period. So again, a lot of inefficient use of the resources that could improve, that could be even more helpful in times where, as the ones that we are facing today, as Gaston was mentioning in the previous part of this webinar, where all those fiscal resources are so scarce, and we need to make even today much more than it used to be a real efficient use of the scarce resources that we have, right? And again, this is something that we all know, that over the last decades, the level of perceived quality of LAC infrastructure has grown too little compared to other economies. And again, today we only, as a region, we only surpass the quality levels of those of sub-Saharan African countries. And this is not a metric just to compare. This has to do a lot with the economic growth and inequality in the region. LAC has an infrastructure quality lower than it should be according to their income levels, and that has a huge impact on the competitiveness of the economies and the quality of life of the users. And let's finally particularly focus on some numbers on the importance of properly preparing projects to deal in advance with the social, environmental, and land conflicts in the infrastructure development. The numbers that you are seeing on the screen are part of an IDB study, where you can see how the inefficient planning is the main source of social and environmental conflict when it comes to proper preparation. So how we move forward towards a more sustainable infrastructure, and particularly through PPPs? Well, this is a study that we are about to publish, and sorry right now that I can see now that this slide is part in Spanish, but we will be happy to share soon the results with you. So I was saying that we are about to publish this diagnosis on the environmental, land, and social conflicts to provide recommendations for action for the countries, with the aim of providing some insights to develop a more sustainable infrastructure through PPPs. Together with some experts, internal and external environmental experts on the phases of project planning and development, we identify some different dimensions and specific issues related to these socio-environmental conflicts, and with a particular focus on land issues, where we see that there's a huge need for experience and good practices in the region. And what we have observed in this study, soon to be released together between the PPP unit and the climate change division of the bank, is that 88% of projects in Latin America and the Caribbean that have been analyzed show both cost overruns and time delays associated mainly to land, environmental, and some social issues. And this is something that we can quantify the effect of it, right? The evidence presented in this study will show how inadequate land management for the infrastructure project can generate some cost overrun that can get up to 80% of total budget. And numbers are similar when we focus to social conflicts, but this is something that we are going to go in depth in the study that we would be more than happy to share with you. Finally, in here, what we would like you to give as a message is that for us, it's key strength. It's key to improve, to strengthen the regulatory and the institutional frameworks for proper project development, for the supervision and monitoring of those projects from the environmental, social, and land perspective, and overall the importance of an adequate identification, evaluation, and allocation of different risks from the early stages of the project to the very last phases of it. For us, in order to better prepare projects, we feel like these external even project preparation facilities that have been created by MDBs can be an important source or tool for financing for governments to prepare bankable infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure projects. But again, if we go through the whole presentation that I wanted to share with you today, and if we compare the cost that we mentioned at the very beginning with the avoided cost of investing in the pre-investment phase, we can see how it's totally worth it. And every single tool, such as the one that my colleagues has presented today, aim to improve project preparation and delivery, and particularly on those social and environmental dimensions, and particularly on land issues, may have a huge impact in how we conceive and develop sustainable infrastructure in a way that it can reach the whole potential that it can have, not only answering the user's need, but as I was saying at the very beginning, to inform investors in a better way, so we all can make better decisions, and overall to improve the competitiveness of Latin American economies and the quality of life of its citizens. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ankur. We are basically on just completed with the time. I'm gonna take just a couple of questions. I think I hope we might stay a couple of minutes more on the platform, but please, if you have other calls, webinars to join, feel free to drop. I think one point raised by David of Cadmus is particularly important, and the question is whether the distinction between public and private is always a clear cut. And he makes the example of an utility operator implementing a large infrastructure. I'm gonna start my perspective on this. I think it's about inviting the other panelists to comment as well. It's not always a clear cut. Actually, in the project with Jamaica, we saw that while discussing PPPs, we needed to actually bring this conversation upstream to the very beginning of the project cycle at the public side. Because we also don't want to create, let's say, arbitrage. We don't want to create different processes for projects that are public, PPPs, or completely private. David, I would suggest you to go and check in the material, the first webinar, the presentation from Albert Daly, on how this exact topic is being treated in Jamaica from the at the complete public side before the procurement decision. So to give an assessment of risk for any project, be them public, unsolicited proposals, or PPPs. But it's a very relevant issue, and in the toolkit we show what are the areas that should be equal with all projects, mostly what we discussed today. There are areas in which the private sector and the distribution of risk with the private sector is a bit more peculiar for PPPs or for completely private projects. But this is a question that we have to confront every time, and I guess in practice, the being blurred lines, it's something that PPP professionals and counterparty have to face with. I don't know if on this issue, Marcel, Elisa, Ankur, you have different perspective.
No, I agree, John Leo. I think the reason we brought up the distinction between public and private was in the context of the value for money assessment, because you want to compare different delivery models. But I fully agree, it should be a spectrum of options and trying to find the best possible solution for the project and also in dealing with climate risk.
I see Mari Carmen has replied directly to Dave on a technical clarification question on risk assessment. I don't see any other comprehensive questions. Just reminding everybody, we will be sharing the presentation. The recording will be available on the platform as well, and we will send an invitation again to comment on the toolkit The cool toolkit has 4 different sections, so feel free to also focus, read, and comment and suggest in inputs for a particular question, for a particular session. It's a quite hefty document, but I guess each of us has expertise in specific session or parts of the project cycle, and we'll invite you to comment where on the parts that you feel more comfortable with. Thank you, Gaston, Ankur, Elisa, Mari Carmen, Daniela, Marcel, and again, DBJ for being a great partner of this project. We'll give you the appointment for next week when we're going to discuss financing issues and transaction management issues. Thank you again, and to the next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.